Well, I'm a researcher who went to the dark side. Not really the dark side, but I started out as a researcher by training. And when I was a postdoc at the University of Minnesota, I got recruited to serve on the IRB there. Um, and so I served on the IRB there for a number of years, and I was trying to decide whether I wanted to go on to a faculty position. And I really fell in love with research ethics. And so I decided to do that permanently. I got a position at children's hospitals and clinics of Minnesota. And I also continued my relationship with the University of Minnesota, serving on their IRB and eventually over time as an associate chair and a chair there. So I think I've always been a researcher at heart. I have a very kind of analytical mind, and so even as a young student in school, I was interested in sort of finding out the why things happen. So that was my orientation. So I went to an undergrad, and I got involved in research very early as an undergrad student, helping faculty members with their research because I just had that sort of drive to know why, and particularly interested in children and issues also related to health. So that just kind of started me on my career path. So I guess actually starting as an undergrad. When you start, you're very idealistic. I mean, I think that's part of being a young person, being idealistic like that. And there's a lot more constraints, I think, than you really realize. You know, there's sort of the grant funding and, trying to write a grant so that someone will fund it, not to do necessarily the work that you think you want to do or that you're interested in doing. And so there's a lot of complexities in the regulatory environment and just the whole, and not everyone necessarily always has the best of intentions, maybe. Maybe there's monetary gain or, and that obviously was not my perspective when I initially thought it. I wanted to save the world and, do something good like that for the world. So I'm very detail oriented, and I bet you will hear everybody who, at some level, who does IRB work for a living, that they're detail oriented. I think that helps you focus. But I think for me in particular, having been a researcher and now doing the research ethics piece, having an understanding of how that process works helps me do my job better because I can understand why they're wanting to do something and help them do that. And really that's one of the things that I think is most important about doing what I do in sort of my own personal philosophy is, yes, of course, it's absolutely about protecting human subjects and the highest ethical standards, but it's also about promoting research because that's important and that's why we do what we do. So it's both, helping people promote their research and do good work in a context that's safe and ethical for human subjects. There's never enough bodies and time to do all the things that you would like to do. And honestly, I think one of the places where we have the most impact is really that personal relationship that you develop with investigators and research teams and staff, and having that time, them having the time and you having the time to really interact with them, because I think that's really where they get it and you start to get what they're doing and you work together and to build that collaborative relationship. And there really isn't enough time in the day to do that. Plus just education, money to educate staff, to educate researchers, for all of us to keep building because everything is always changing and we're learning more and more, and there's not enough money for that piece. And I think institutions sometimes, not necessarily mine, but don't always value that educational piece as not necessarily a preventive sort of thing, but as an important part of that whole research process. It's just as important as the great outcome of the new drug that helps mitigate this disease. That's important, helping develop that ethical mindset. The tenor of this particular conference has been a lot about social media and how our world has changed even in the past 10 years as far as Instagram and Twitter and different methods of technology, and that is growing so quickly, almost more quickly than we're sort of scrambling. All of us are scrambling to sort of keep up with that and to figure out, okay, this is interesting and we can do this, and what are the privacy and confidentiality issues? How do we make sure people are truly providing informed consent and that this is valuable, and how do we meld that? And that's just one area. Genetics is still, we don't talk, that's kind of not the hot topic right now, but that's still an area where we can know something about people from a piece of hair that we never would have known before, and there's attendant benefits to that and also risk. What we find out about them, we find out about their family members, just all kinds of things. And that's sort of that perpetual treadmill up the hill, trying to keep keep up with those things. Things like this conference are very, networking with people, because generally people, something happens and it starts someplace and then it kind of spreads, and a lot of us are dealing with the same kinds of issues, and that's really one of the great things about Primer. We heard this morning, that's one of the fabulous things, is that everyone's so willing to share information and to sort of work together. And so it might take more, whether it's at a higher level, maybe regulatorily, maybe there'll be some new regulations or guidance coming out about particular areas, and making sure that we have a voice in that piece so that we're heard on that, and then just kind of working together to sort of generate ideas about how we might handle some of these things, because some of them you don't know necessarily what the next thing is. I mean, I don't think any of us would have predicted, the Twitter, Instagram kind of things and some of the attendant risks. So trying to sort of see where that's going, but really to be flexible too, to really keep open minds and sort of work with that partnership. And one thing I just thought of too would be, really trying to continue to solidify those relationships with researchers, because that's where the ideas are coming from. So really, working with the new generation of researchers in whatever fields those are that are generating these ideas, because if we start that on the front end, you're a lot better off than trying to catch up and fix things on the back end. As much as you tell subjects, and I think the literature backs this up, they really think that it is for their benefit. And I know people are altruistic, but sometimes I think they participate because they think in the back of their mind that there might be some direct benefit to them, even for, say, an early phase clinical trial where it's really a dose ranging study where maybe there could be, but really that's certainly not any intent at all. So I think there's that side, and then there's the other side where people are skeptical, different populations who have had injustices against them and are sort of the other side of the coin, where they completely mistrust the research system, which is unfortunate, but certainly understandable, but trying to work so that they could understand that there is some benefit, potentially overall to society and potentially to them down the road. So those two sides. There was one on informed consent by Nancy Cass, talking about her belief and her desire for more people to understand. I think she used the word consent as a dialogue. And that really resonates with me, partly because I sort of have this general belief that, and I think a lot of people in our field do, that research is a privilege that's granted to researchers by the subject's willingness to participate. And part of that process involves that dialogue. It's not that piece of paper. It's that having that conversation with the subject about what your research is about, and making sure that they're informed, and really having that back and forth. It's not just, here's what my study's about, okay, do you want to participate? It's really that conversation, and developing a relationship in some way, and developing also an understanding of research and what this is about. And that piece is so important. And I think even sometimes today we still see that in certain fields where people are just not, researchers themselves are not sort of grasping how important that is, and that it doesn't end with signing that piece of paper, that it's an ongoing process and that relationship with the subject. So that really resonated with me. When we review research, and I think it comes up more often for us with social science, and partly I think that's true because in biomedical research there's sort of already a model related to informed consent. It's different than research-informed consent, but they sort of have that model, so they grasp it a little bit better. Social scientists, particularly in fields that are not traditionally, human subjects fields, psychology, obviously they have more of that tradition, but maybe engineering or something that seems a little more disparate that isn't used to that kind of interaction, really educating them and working with them. So when we have researchers or students come into our office to talk about a project they want to do, really talking with them about that and eliciting that information, describing what kind of things we want to see, and trying to elicit that not only in our conversation with them, but so that we can have that documented so that the committee can review them, and sort of emphasizing that and going out and doing educational talks about those kinds of things, particularly to those groups, so they have an understanding. what that's really about and why. And usually we have a really great response to that when people understand why we're doing that, why it's important, where it's coming from. They really get it, and you see this light bulb go on, and it's especially heartwarming for me to see that. As humans, that's our natural reaction, our natural affinity is to connect with other people. We're designed that way. And so I think that's really important for us to do that, because it creates that good feeling about research and understand, even if that person doesn't want to participate, that's a good response, that you know you did a good job then because they understood what you were saying and made a choice not to. So my preference really is definitely, I mean, the form is important. It's how we document the process, and then we still need to make sure that those are adequate. But I think really focusing on where are you going to get consent, who's going to get the consent, who else is going to be there, when. Timing is a crucial piece, particularly much more so for, say, biomedical studies, when you may be having someone who's newly diagnosed with a disease and they're in shell shock, or doing a staged consent process where you sort of talk about one part and they consent and then they talk about another part, or revisiting consent if you have a longitudinal study over time. And that is certainly something we do see with some of our social science studies when you have a longitudinal study. So I think those pieces are pieces that are really important to focus on, and I've always tried to get away from sort of the nitpicking about the consent form. As long as it has the required elements, I think that's less, then it's fine. I'm not going to nitpick whether you use this word or that word. And thinking about, the other piece is thinking about alternate forms of consent. So we're talking, a lot of the sessions are about mobile consent on mobile devices and research on mobile devices, and thinking about different ways we might obtain and document consent and still meet the regulations, but really meet the needs of subjects, because we don't all learn in the same way. So that's why I think multimedia, even a dialogue is absolutely essential, but also visuals and different ways of learning and that sort of thing. I think that's so important. One of the things I think I was the most proud of is not in my current position. I've been there about 4 years, but I worked for a children's hospital for many years, and that really resonated. That mission of that institution really resonated with me. Now you are going to make me cry. And I came in on a Christmas Eve for a child who was very, very ill, and they couldn't get this particular drug, and so they needed someone to come in so they could get a release so that the drug could be released, and that I came in, and that did happen, and that child lived. I'm also proud of the years I was at the University of Minnesota, IRB. I was brought on right after they had suffered some very big troubles. Moira Keene was the director who only recently retired, and she was fabulous, and she sort of righted that ship, and over her years has really served as a tremendous leader in our field of human research protections, and started working with the CIP process. She was one of the first with that group, and with AHARP being really a leader in that process. And so Minnesota has seen a lot of changes, and I'm proud of that, and that's a great program. I know they've had some troubles lately, but that's just a tremendous program, and I think it's a model for a lot of other institutions of creative ways of continuing to do the work that we do, because I think we need to sort of think of different ways to do, the same old model isn't going to work, and if we don't start changing it, I think we found that when we created the CIP. If we don't start changing it ourselves, someone else is going to come in and start changing things for us. So we need to be ahead of the game and sort of see the areas where we need to make changes or improvements ourselves. And I think Primer has done an excellent job of keeping us to the fore in that. So.